I'd like to welcome all of you to our session today. My name is Kelvin Lee. I'm the Institute Director for the National Institute for Innovation in Manufacturing Biopharmaceuticals, or NIIMBL, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session today. I'm here with two panelists. The first that I'll introduce is Delara Motlagh. She's Vice President of Cell Therapy Technologies for Terumo Blood and Cell Technologies. Delara is a global business leader in the area of cell therapy technologies at Terumo Blood and Cell Therapies, and headquartered in Lakewood, Colorado. She brings more than 15 years of experience in biotechnology and healthcare in various therapeutic areas, including oncology, cardiology, orthopedics, hematology, and nephrology. She's passionate about cell and gene therapy and that market and the potential to bring these innovative therapies to improve the lives of patients. Prior to her work at Terumo Blood and Cell Therapies, she served in diverse leadership roles at Baxter Healthcare in marketing, R&D, and operations, and has a PhD in physiology and biophysics from the University of Illinois, a fellowship in vascular tissue engineering from Northwestern, and an executive MBA from Kellogg. The other panelist to join me today is Claudia Zylberberg. She's founder and CEO of Akron Biotech, a manufacturer of novel cGMP grade products for cell and gene therapy industries and companies. She also co-founded another company, Assure Immune, which is an adult stem cell bank for personalized medicine. Many of you will know Claudia, that she's been heavily engaged with the Standards Coordinating Body, or SCB, as well as the International Society for Cell and Gene Therapy, the CCRM, and also the Regenerative Medicine Forum at the National Academies. And in addition to being a very accomplished scientist and innovator, she's also author of a children's book, You're Full of Genes. So we'll hear from them in a few moments. I'm gonna begin the session by offering some remarks, and then Delara and Claudia will offer their remarks, and then we'll move into some Q&A. And what I wanted to really reflect as a start is to tell you very briefly about NIIMBL. We are a public-private partnership. Many of you may have heard of us. We're co-funded in part out of the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, or NIST, with a $70 million cooperative agreement that is leveraged with a significant amount of additional non-federal funding. To date, we have about 160 member organizations, including 15 of the top leading global biopharma companies working in the cell and gene therapy space. Our mission is to accelerate biopharmaceutical manufacturing innovation and support the development of standards for more efficient and rapid manufacturing capability, and also to educate and train a world-leading biopharmaceutical manufacturing workforce, which is critically important in the cell and gene space, as many of you will know. What NIIMBL does as a consortia is we try to identify the areas of technology need and in training needs that really serve the broad industry's needs the most, in terms of trying to effectively lift all boats. So identifying the technologies that are needed through road mapping activities, and then investment and co-investment in technology projects, in identifying and working with stakeholders to understand what the needs are as they pertain to standards or reference materials, and trying to advance those interests, as well as trying to work with some of the large and small companies on defining best what the training needs are. Because as you know, as people work in operations, particularly in some of the cell therapy areas, it's critical to have people who are very skilled and capable of doing that job as effectively as possible. So we work with a lot of partners around the country, certainly with a lot of major universities, a lot of small companies, of course, the couple of key federal agencies. And we also work with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. We sponsor the ACell project and the AGene project, as well as a number of others. And we do that also by collaborating with suppliers, manufacturers, those in cold chain and in workforce development. So we work carefully with the industry and broadly with the industry. We look forward to working with others, and that gives us an opportunity and eye on a lot of the different needs in the industry. And we'll try to bring some of that to bear in the conversations today. So with that, I'm gonna turn the floor over to Delara and hear some of her perspective on the needs in the industry as she sees them. Delara?
Thank you, Kelvin, and delighted to be here. So, maybe before I start, I think your comment on needs is really important. And when I think of the different stakeholders and their needs in this industry, particularly as they move into GMP manufacturing, I think of the academics or researchers, the biotechs, or the CMOs. And as they go from translational research all the way through commercializing a therapy, their needs continue to evolve. So, for example, the early researchers, they're really focused on the science and incorporating whatever modifications they're making to the process, whether it's for a cell or gene therapy. They're focused on functionality, cell identity, and really establishing that process. Then as they move into clinicals, really an eye to safety and efficacy through the clinical trial development process. And it's really as this evolves that there's this need for reproducibility and a control of the process that is not only allows them to align with regulatory guidance, but also to be compliant with GMP requirements. And what's interesting is if you look kind of early on, the process really requires a lot of flexibility, right? So there's a need to be able to do process development, and that towards the end really shifts to locking down your process in order to be able to achieve the control, the reproducibility, and ultimately to eliminate risk. Now, one way to do that is by automating the manufacturing process, and many would agree that this is really needed and helps to eliminate the risk. The challenge that many have is really understanding when. When do you actually automate these processes to achieve this reproducibility? Now, what's interesting is as you look at the continuum, the drive or readiness of automation increases as you get closer to commercialization. The challenge with that, of course, is that there's very high switching costs when you're later in development and early commercialization. And this would potentially lead to having to requalify your process or even generate additional clinical data. So as there's a drive to lock down the process faster, the earlier that these developers can automate their process, it allows them to transition into GMP manufacturing with more ease, as well as the regulatory discussions that need to be had. And so we've actually already seen that many of the early stage biotechs have kind of learned this lesson, and they're automating their processes earlier. And not only does that give them the benefit of locking down their process, but it also in some cases can help accelerate their development. So these are, I think, interesting, points of decision as many of these stakeholders are navigating their way through GMP.
Thank you for that. Claudia, I'd like to leave the floor for you.
Great. Well, definitely the one view of this GMP transition is the equipment and the automation of it. The other one that presents a lot of variables and risk are the ancillary materials that are used in the manufacture of these complex technologies. Aside from the monoclonal antibodies, I think that this is one of the most complex manufacturing processes we've ever seen. Most of the components are biologics in itself, and so presents more challenges and variability than ever we could imagine, at least on the regulatory side and the traceability and the reproducibility of processes as we speak. So definitely there is a lot of eyes seeing the ancillary material environment. Again, looking into the processes themselves, they are not processes that render a product that can be sterilized, and we know that already. So that means that the controls in process and the control of the ancillary materials and the sterility of those are becoming of very big importance. The interesting thing is that complexity of the materials goes from human-derived products that today presents the risk of viral contamination to recombinant proteins that bring a lot of endotoxin to the system, or others that could be manufactured in a research environment and perhaps with less controls. So the complexity of the mixture that needed for the cells to achieve what we are looking for, it's a challenge. And for that, I think that we need to establish very strong relationship with the providers, create a partnership, And the sooner, I know that the sooner we start with the GMP process with the components, the better, although there is a cost associated with that. And sometimes we say quality is just paperwork, but that paperwork means that behind you have a lot of data that support that validation or documentation on the analytical side and on the process side that needs to be achieved, and that has a cost. And sometimes for small scale and for early stages, it's a very high cost to bear. But I think that at the end of the day, it pays and renders a lot of satisfaction, I should say, because at the end of the day, you have a process that is very predictable, components that are very much used to the cells and the cells to them. So at the end of the day, you're talking about a process that is, everybody can be comfortable, even on the regulatory side. So definitely, I think that a good eye has been put into the NCI materials from the upstream side to the downstream side, and eventually the impact even on the clinical environment. And I should say that with the NCA materials, I think that we will talk a little bit later on standards and so forth, but I think that it's important to understand the risks associated with those and create a risk assessment early on to make sure that we are using the best components that we can, that we have the partnership with the providers, and we take care of all the risks associated with the products if they don't present sterility or viral inactivation, which is a challenge, at least on 2020. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I thought I'd start the conversation with you, Delara. You talked a little bit about how in the beginning of process development, you want that flexibility at your organization, but then of course, as you mature towards commercialization, you really want to have things locked down. So, you I'm sure interact quite a bit with companies across that spectrum of from clinical development all the way through to commercialization. I'm curious what your experience has been in terms of those companies and what they observe and what their concerns are and their perspectives are about the GMP requirements. Are there, for example, gaps or blind spots for early stage companies versus middle or versus late stage companies in their development in various aspects of the GMPs, electronic records, clean room classification, other kinds of issues? What's your experience been there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And maybe, one thing I'll start with is, the market is rapidly evolving and it's learning and growing. So I do believe that the market has really, and many of the stakeholders in it have learned from those who have come before. So if you look at those who pioneered in the industry and launched the first products, there's been some learnings of what can be replicated and then what could be improved as folks are bringing new products. So one learning is really making sure that there's an investment in the capabilities as well as the capacity to achieve commercial scale. And so, when you think of scale, you think of, making sure that you're able to meet the needs of the patients, right? The number of patients that need to be served, as well as meeting the therapeutic dose. And so having those processes in place, I think that's one key one. So for example, making that transition in their process to be able to take on a heavier patient load. The other is, closed systems. So, and we've already heard this in some of Claudia's remarks as well. One of the key themes in this space is reduction of risk. You're already dealing with very complex therapies. And so whatever can be done to reduce risk becomes really important. And so closed or functionally closed systems in whatever capacity really help to reduce that risk. They also give some efficiencies, right? If you think of your staffing considerations, I know NIIMBL's been very involved in how do you educate and kind of train this workforce. So there's a lot of considerations there. And then of course there's moving into a clean room. Clean room classifications can be impacted by how open your process and system are. And so these are, I think, really important learnings that have been had from those who came before. On top of that, as you're moving into a GMP environment and as our knowledge and experience there grows, if you think through the GMP grade solutions and starting to identify those early, as Claudia pointed out, there's many considerations from, chemically identified media as well as the different reagents and what's going to work in your process, and what's also going to be available when you scale. There's also in making sure that as these regulations come to light, right, not just GMP, but even from a CFR Part 11 with electronic records and signatures and managing that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done as people actually understand the nomenclature and the language, but then also what processes do you put in place to ensure that you're compliant, and how do you show that? And then data management overall. There isn't a shortage of data that's generated, but making sure that not only are you ensuring your compliance, but that you have traceability across chain of custody, for example, and material tracing. So these are, I think, some of the learnings that have been had. You also asked a great question around gaps and blind spots. And one of the key, I think, learnings and gaps, right, that have been identified is really looking at this process holistically. So vein to vein, and there's so many different touch points of these of these products as they move through that process. So, for example, in many cases, manufacturers always assumed that they just kind of inherited the incoming products. Now there's really a think of, what do we need and can we influence it? So that there's been a key focus there. Also, a lot of emphasis tends to go on the more scientific part of the process where you modify the cells, for example, or if you're expanding. However, it just pushes some of the pain points in the manufacturing process further downstream, and areas where we kind of thought certain manual processes may have been sufficient, we're really realizing the pains that they can create. And so anticipating some of those needs, I think that's a blind spot as well. And just overarching, understanding the process in order to be able to determine if there's a change, if you have to qualify a new reagent. One of the key ways to be able to do this is having an analytical kind of understanding of your process and being able to define it, so that when you have to show comparability, you're able to do so in a reliable manner, and one that is less painful when you really understand your process. And I would say, last but not least, as you think about different organizations and companies getting their legs under them in this environment, there's a lot of alignment needed between all the different functions that also are responsible. We've already talked about regulatory and kind of process development and R&D, clinical development, but ultimately, the manufacturing organization, the quality organization, to help drive some of these processes. So many gaps that are being filled, and a lot of partnership and collaboration to get us there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Claudia, I'd like to, ask your perspective as a supplier, but a supplier that works, I think, with, companies that are earlier in development and then watches them grow, and as they presumably also rely on more and more of your products. Are there pieces of advice that you could give to those organizations that are maybe earlier in development, that are hoping and expecting to eventually be able to scale up production if they're successful? Particularly advice around, supply chain and how they should be thinking about that.
Thank you, Kevin, for the question. The truth is, when they are small, they don't think too much in advance. They have so many holes to cover that thinking about consumables is one of the least of their worries. They have too many things juggling at the same time. But the truth is, the earlier that they can start working on the GMP compliance of their ancillary materials, the better will be. The point here is, as Delara mentioned, the quality is costly, and the automation and the closing of the systems brings the closing of the systems of the consumables. Let's say putting in vials or in bags, putting in syringes, and so forth. And for that, you need validations around it and make sure that the product don't have leachables and extractables, and they can work in the environment that are now setting up in the automated system that Delara Terumo is doing, for example, or Octane or Zuri or whatever you. So the point here is that the cost of that validation and repackaging those products, it's high and cannot be only on the supplier, has to be that partnership with customers. So at the beginning, in stage one or phase one or preclinical, they can live with the product that has the packaging off the shelf and work on the closing the system later on. That is one part of the piece of the puzzle. The other one is on the testing side, perhaps live with the testing that the COV comes with and create a plan for the next phases to build up a more robust testing behind and qualification of that raw material. The third part of it is on the biological products, try to figure out a way to do viral inactivation. You don't want to have surprises at the end of the day. And I know that is a high cost at the very upfront, but it's, again, something that you will not regret at the end of the day and sitting with the regulatory agencies discussing your product. So there are a couple of things that can be done ahead and can we live with. And again, having secondary suppliers and having an opportunity to understand the logistics around it, given the 2020 environment today, that there are some delays in shipments and delayed in consumables that affect even the production of the ancillary materials. I think it is important to have that big picture visibility that sometimes when they are early on, they don't have it. They only see the plate in front of them, not the big picture, unfortunately. But I know that many are getting more educated as we go and learn, and understanding that having all these pieces ahead of time brings them a kind of a safety and sleeping well at night, I think, at the end of the day.
Well, I think you've touched on, I think you both touched on, this is a relatively young field, right? When you compare it to a lot of other types of products that are on the market, I think the whole field is still learning. The whole field is developing the technologies that can make for more robust processes. The whole field is beginning to appreciate and understand what some of the needs are in order to go commercial. And as part of that, you know, there's just a natural learning that happens as people become experienced with one company and then they get an opportunity to move to another company. Those experiences kind of share and diversify across the industry in a way that I think helps everybody, but it's still relatively early days, I would argue. Now that said, Delara, I want to come back to you because, you know, we put in the description of this session a comment that, you know, 2020 has been a remarkable year, and I know we're all living that, and would agree with that. And so I'm wondering if you can share what impact, if any, you're observing with respect to your business. What are you hearing from your customers about the impact of COVID-19 in terms of any of the relevant issues? It could be patient recruitments, it could be manufacturing capacity, your own supply chain to the extent that there's anything to discuss there, or other kinds of impacts. It's been an interesting year.
Interesting is the key word there, Kelvin. But, you know, maybe before going into maybe our organizational impact, one of the things that's really I've been impressed with is that the cell and gene therapy space has proven to be quite nimble. And, you know, being able to kind of pivot with some existing technologies and kind of be on the leading edge of developing other ones to help treat either COVID or related associated diseases that come from that. So I think ARM is actually tracking 11 clinical trials in regenerative medicine to treat COVID, and about 25 earlier stage, you know, preclinical work that's moving forward. So I think as an industry, we can be proud to be in an environment that's really very swiftly trying to come up with therapies. As I look at the, you know, some of the key challenges in the industry and what some of my peers as well as customers are facing, I think the manufacturing and the clinical whether it's for clinical or for commercial manufacturing. This has continued during the pandemic. I think companies have really made a concerted effort to keep their manufacturing moving swiftly and efficiently, given the challenges. It's rarely where the patient enrollment, given some of the challenges that the hospitals are having in managing COVID patients, has been a key challenge. And as Claudia alluded, there's been supply chain challenges, whether it's from transportation of being able to move product around the world, as well as, even just, a battle over PPE to be able to have the right materials going into the manufacturing environment. And then of course, raw materials are impacted. And so one of the things we see is many companies are trying to stockpile materials given some of the uncertainty. Again, whether it's reagents, whether it's materials, that my organization provides, PPE, gloves, all sorts of, just in order to make sure that they have the assurance that they can have continuity in their work. On the earlier development, right, folks that are doing a bit more process development or early research, there was a time where things had slowed a bit, particularly as they were minimizing staff that were actually going into labs or offices. And so some of that work was deprioritized in order to pivot and be able to support some of the other functions. For us as an organization, what we have found during this time that was kind of a reigning direction for us is having the final patients in mind, and making sure that support was the key thing that we were continuing to provide. So as we support our customers, so our field service and support teams, for example, continued to work during the pandemic and had to be mindful, because as you can imagine, many of these hospitals, unless it was really patient critical, did not want additional people on site. And so having to navigate that. We also have field application scientists that work with customers in the field, and they continue to support them in person where appropriate, but really having to think creatively in how we can support teams virtually. And that's been, I think, a lesson that we will all learn during these times of how we can become more efficient in a virtual way across many industries, certainly not just ours. And I think for us, we also were very mindful. Our manufacturing teams were really fully operational during the pandemic. And that was just to ensure that we were able to provide product to our customer base and keep them moving, especially since we're a diversified company and providing products to many that are critically ill in the hospital environment, and making sure that those products are making it there. So I think some of the pivot points for us, but really I think support was the key focus. And of course, working creatively, as I'm sure many are doing at these times.
Thanks, Claudia. I wanted to basically ask you a very similar or the same question. What observations or lessons learned do you have? We're still relatively early, probably by some regards, in terms of the pandemic and its impact on the industry in terms of understanding it. But what is your perspective on lessons learned or observations you have?
Well, and in addition to what Delara says, that actually it covers quite a large base. The truth is, not having that many clinical trials, we have a large base of customers, and we provide them with a lot of materials for the manufacture of these cell therapies, that eventually the clinical trials being either halted or the recruitment was a little bit slower and stopped because of the pandemic. So definitely we saw the impact on the manufacturing side at the beginning, at March and April. But when this became kind of a status quo and we are going to live with this for a little longer than a couple of months, people started to adjust quickly and see what next and prepare themselves for post-COVID-19, because this will be finished at one point, we hope. And with that means that we need to be better prepared than ever afterwards. On the stockpiling side, on decentralizing the supply chain somehow, and have a couple of lots back up for our customers in case they need it and they were not able to project themselves because things were fluid and in their situations. And of course, understanding that the supply chain, and basically because airlines are flying less, and so we have less opportunities to ship materials globally. We need to be very cognizant that planning is key, and it could be one of the best lessons learned. Planning not only on products on the shelves, products on stock, and be able to cover the basis for these customers that eventually will come online running, not walking, running because of the idle time that they've been having at the moment. So let's get ready when they are ready. That's our motto right now. But it's been a challenge in different ways, but basically because of the logistics mostly, and the lack of the flights that usually we use besides FedEx, commercial for carrying cargo all over the globe. So it's a little bit of an interesting time, but everybody accommodates. Human nature has that opportunity to adapt quickly, as we have seen in the last few months.
I appreciate especially that last remark that you made. I think despite all the challenges we all face, I have seen, and I'm sure you've all seen, many examples of organizations and individuals trying to figure out ways to solve problems that a year ago they never would have imagined they would have had to solve that particular problem. But it's the situation we're in, and people figure out a path forward to continue trying to bring these treatments to patients in need. I want to talk a little bit about opportunities around standards, and so maybe Delara, I'll come back to you. We certainly think about it, but we're not the only organization. There's many that think about standards and the value of trying to bring particularly technology providers, meaning vendors and suppliers in the industry, bringing them together to the proverbial table alongside those product manufacturers, the drug product manufacturers, to talk about industry-wide standards and potentially reference materials if that's appropriate. So, standards can be around data ontologies, how the data is organized. It can be around interfaces to connect pieces of equipment together. It can be around reference materials. It can also be a challenge, I think, from the perspective of a vendor or supplier. You might want to be at that table to understand the conversation, but some vendors would say, depending on what that standard is, we don't want to lose our unique intellectual property position and the things that we think make our product special. So I'm interested in your thoughts about opportunities for the community to develop standards that support the broad ecosystem, but still carve out and have enough room for vendors and suppliers to have that intellectual property, those unique products, to ensure that they have a robust business model. What are some of the challenges with getting suppliers to work on standards, if any? What are your perspective and thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really key question because there's, I would say, a real calling for standardization in this industry. It's a gap. It's been identified, and you already referenced, Kelvin, the work that ARM is doing in partnership for ACell and AGene to really help kind of bring stakeholders together and share best practices and have some guidance, because that's kind of sorely lacking. I think some of the challenges, and you've hit on some of them, but even if I look at the developers of these therapies, we often hear that the process is the product. And so when you think about that, there's a lot of proprietary information and IP tied in the process. And so there's a reluctancy to share information that could lead to a standardization. So I think that's a real key challenge. And if you also think, I mentioned earlier that researchers and developers really need flexibility in their process. And as you look across that, this becomes a challenge as well, because depending on what they're doing, that may not be available. There's also inconsistency in whether it's starting materials, raw materials, any incoming products. A lot of this is lacking. So when you think of standards, it's all encompassing. And then of course there's variability in SOPs, whether it's around testing, how materials are processed, what the outcomes, right, and how that impacts the overall. So I think there's many challenges, but at the same time, you know, I do believe that there's some table stakes information that can be shared. And really as a community, it's going to ask for us to come together to be able to define what some of these critical parameters are that people are willing to share, and can do so knowing that it doesn't put them in a compromising position. I don't think this is limited to the suppliers in the industry. I think it's the developers as well, and understanding the needs in a holistic way. So for example, you know, one of the things that we're doing, and you heard me allude to manufacturers for a long time, just kind of would assume that whatever starting materials they got, that's what they were going to get, and they had to design their manufacturing process around that. And one of the things we're trying to do in the industry is help kind of connect those that are collecting the apheresis product, because apheresis still drives about 60% of the products in the market. And how can a better understanding of the control over that apheresis product allow the manufacturers to really be able to dictate what's in the bag? And it's work like this that helps to facilitate for the whole industry, right? If you can say, I have a better understanding of my process, and therefore I can dictate what I want in the bag, it allows you to optimize that incoming product for your process, which eliminates risk overall. And this is one key way that we are trying to help drive standardization in the industry. But there's also other parameters, and I think you alluded to it. So as you look across the different applications, what types of tests, you know, need to be done? If you're looking at glucose levels or pH or temperature, you know, what are some of the key things that can be monitored, as well as, you know, is there a standardized methodology that can be used so that you get some consistency between facilities and companies? And then finally, you know, having some flexibility to allow you to do your process development, but in a modular way that can be integrated into your process. And Kelvin, you alluded to this. So there's many different technologies out there. So how to have them be modular enough that they can fit into your process and be seamless with different processes, and not only to integrate functionality, but also from a data perspective. And these types of parameters will help with the standardization. But as I mentioned, it's going to really be a number of us coming to the table to help facilitate that conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. You know, Claudia, you've been very, I think, active, you know, with the SCB and others. You know, what are your thoughts related to both the value of standards as well as, you know, challenges in trying to get there?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been involved with the standardization of this industry from the very, very beginning. And I can see that it's growing, and it's growing, and you have a lot of stakeholders on the table, and people are starting to understand actually how important they are. The ancillary materials one, the cryopreservation with PDA, you know, the actually the logistics and transportation and bioprocessing, many of these initiatives that came through the SCB with ISO, and in collaboration with NIST and in collaboration with the FDA, because the FDA is sponsoring in some way the SCB. I think that it is becoming actually a real thing because we've been from the very early stage where nobody was sitting and pushing companies to sit on the table was a very difficult task. And at the end of the day, they understood that if they are on the table, don't complain if you were not on the table, because the standards will be there and they will regulate what you're doing. And if you know were not there at the very beginning, then things will come to you and you will have to comply. And guess what? That's what I see, that's why people are getting more involved and understand the value of it. And of course, with the standardization comes the control of the cost of goods, the control of the process, because things become a little bit more fluid. So I think that the value of the standardization comes from different angles, and I think people are starting to understand that. We have many initiatives through the SCB, and you know, NIIMBL is sitting on the table as well. I was actually last week in the Rapid Microbial Testing Consortium, because rapid microbial testing is also one of the critical pieces of the puzzle. And ISO is sitting down with many manufacturers of testing for in-process and release testing that are coming along. So we see a lot of movement in the space. The amount of consortia that is building up around testing, raw materials, bioprocessing, because at the end of the day, we don't know if we are going to centralize this process or decentralize these processes. And at the end of the day, the standards will play a critical role in that particular change of setting. So looking forward to see more of that activity, but definitely it's coming along really well. I know that perhaps our gaps that are going to be still important for the industry, like reference materials. I know the USP was very active on that, but it's not sufficient, it's not enough. And so definitely there are many initiatives in regards to that, with the idea to create reference materials for the industry. So it's active, very, very active compared with 4 or 5 years ago. So I can see the fruits of a lot of effort that was done at the beginning of the days a few years back.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I think it's so critical for the field to advance as rapidly as possible. I think it will be built on our ability to develop standards that are meaningful and relevant, and providing organizations the opportunity to benefit from them. Well, I do want to, at this point, close the dialogue. I want to certainly thank Delara, Motlagh, and Claudia Zylberberg for being panelists today. I want to thank you in the audience for your time today. This is certainly interesting days, so we appreciate the time that you've made to listen to this panel discussion, and we certainly wish you the very best in terms of your health and your well-being, and look forward to perhaps seeing you all at the meeting on the Mesa next year. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing all of you in person next year and share more of these times together.